Okay. So we just came back from rewatching episode 2 of Avatar the Last Airbender. Again, we love this show. And one thing that we specifically notice is that there's been these 4 elements that we picked up from this episode that kind of establishes the series dynamic. And no, we're not just talking about the bending, even though this episode didn't really show any earth. We're going to talk about the elements that we notice and, just discuss why this element plays a big role within what we see in the series. So let's begin.
Well, what stood out for me the most was the fighting. We have multiple fights between different characters, and it does a lot to kind of establish what we are to expect for the rest of the show. We start with Zuko, and Sokka is basically the one who he has to face off against. And even though Sokka is just, normal person, he still kind of holds his own a little bit. Like, it's not like it's not like he's making it difficult for Zuko or anything.
Are we watching the same episode?
I'm just saying, he still got a hit in. He still got a hit in with the boomerang, trusty boomerang.
That's true.
Still got a hit in.
If Zuko didn't have his helmet on, that boomerang could have done something.
Exactly.
I have a theory that it wasn't Sokka that made the boomerang hit Zuko, but Aang kind of used his airbending to help Sokka. But that's a
no way.
Theory,
You're not gonna take away from my boy.
Hey, it's a team effort. That's all I'm saying.
Well, sure, but
it was still a really cool fight, even though it was pretty one-sided.
Yeah. We established basically Zuko, he doesn't really care about the danger of the women and children that are around. That becomes much more apparent when he's fighting Aang in that same scene a little bit later. And Aang, because he's concerned with everyone else around, and he decides to turn himself in. And so these are character details that we are introduced to through the fights that happen.
I mean, Aang was very irresponsible in the first episode, taking Katara into that booby-trapped ship.
Yeah.
So he has to sort of pay some consequence. I'm glad that he did that. It shows us who Aang is. Like, he's not somebody who's just gonna shy away from taking responsibility, but he's also not somebody who's dumb enough to let himself get caught.
Right. His whole escape attempt was really interesting, and his statement at the very beginning of oh, you guys probably have no idea how to fight an airbender, right? And so he's thinking about the advantages that he has. He is really clever. We get that right off the bat, and we get this more and more as the show continues, that the whole philosophy of the airbenders is mostly, it's not really a head-on fight, and we get to.
I will say it was pretty brutal when Zuko got slapped by the bed.
True.
If it wasn't a bed, man, oh shit.
That's true. But yeah, we get to see the introduction into the details and the intricacies of the different fight styles of the characters and the bending styles.
Yeah. Chuka, you mentioned Mega Man or something like that in the first episode, right? How Aang was supposed to be
a robot. Yeah.
I felt like some Sonic energy when he was running around on the ceiling and whatnot. It was kind of silly at times, which shows a lot of growth in the later episodes, how the animation and how the bending was portrayed later on seems a lot more serious and a lot more powerful and more realistic compared to this episode. Although when he did go into Avatar state, the waterbending was more of that versus sometimes his airbending was just kind of very, very cartoony, but that's okay.
Yeah, I think that's an element of the show definitely improved in its quality after the beginning of the first season, for sure. Just in my mind, comparing fights in this episode to the Zuko and Azula fight, it's none of this compares. But but I get it. The show
it's a nice
improved.
Appetizer. It's a nice taste of what's to come.
Definitely.
Definitely. I think partially why they use bending as fighting was because they were afraid they would come off too violent in the beginning with Nickelodeon, because Nickelodeon, for example, was they weren't really into action cartoons, whatnot, and so they thought an innocent way was they would use the elements to fight each other. So that's another thing behind it, and you can definitely see that with the way it's being portrayed here, which kind of goes into another element of the show, is that it's sort of comedic to an extent, where it's sort of you see this little Sokka gets poked and it comes off a little boing 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 sound kind of thing.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. They did a parallel with that, actually. At first Zuko poked Sokka and made him go away.
Yeah.
And then later on, when Zuko was trying to climb up, he got poked by Sokka, which was funny, you know?
Yeah. So you can kind of see that. But you have Aang, who's this important object, and that in some ways, if Aang gets captured, it's kind of the end of the world. But at the same time, he's also this kid. So it's sort of this silly dynamic where it's like, you have this silly kid having fun while there's sort of this dangerous situation. And you kind of see this being established with like everything Zuko is doing, trying to capture Aang, and it's sort of coming off very comedical, where it's like, it's almost like Road Runner, where it's like, oh, I'm going to grab this thing. And then Aang just goes, bye-bye. And it's almost like he's just trolling this dude the whole time, which is something you kind of see within the series.
Zuko's jump, though. You know how like when Aang got into his glider and Zuko jumped? Dude, Zuko is badass. Like, you know, in the first book, nobody actually views Zuko as like one of the best characters of all time, right?
Yeah.
But like that jump, it was badass.
yes, that jump is definitely a very badass thing.
He didn't
even power himself with the fire boosters that they do later on in the series.
Yeah, man, but that's how confident and determined he is. Another good example is like when Aang comes in and he has the penguin, and then you get the little you have the snow on the kids and they're still being happy about that kind of thing. Or even the part when Iroh starts seeing Appa for the first time and he's like, am I seeing the right thing kind of thing? It's like these little comedical things, or even like, well, you're just a kid. Well, you're a teenager. You know what I'm saying? It's like, it's you really see that's how the dynamic of the show is, where it's like, we're going to have fun. There's going to be these jokes, and this is going to be an important element in the series. So
I think my favorite joke was from Iroh when Zuko captured Aang, took his staff away, and was like, "Oh, put this staff away for me," and then gave it to Iroh, and then Iroh was like, "Oh, do you mind taking this staff to his quarters for me?" And I was like, "That's brilliant."
Yeah.
And it's funny because it kind of brings up this question: how much of a danger is the situation they're in? Because there's always this kind of, even at the ending, where Iroh's like, "Good news, Zuko, it's a kid," and Zuko's all like, "Well, this kid destroyed my ship, man." Like, it's, you kind of see that sort of this, like, there's this innocentness, but there's also this dangerousness, and they're both
their ship's not destroyed.
Well, it's not destroyed, but you get the point.
It's just covered in ice. You
get there's an impact for it, right? So
I get the point. Yeah.
So it's like, it brings up this interesting question, and they play it off really well in the series.
Yeah, which sort of brings me to the third element, which has to do a lot with plot. The show is building up to something. And in this episode, one thing that was in the back of my head, because it's a retrospective, we've watched it all already, is, dude, they were so desperate that all the men of the village literally left them unprotected. That's how bad the war was for the Southern Water Tribe. Yeah. And you can almost see it as a plot hole in ways, right? Like, how could the men do that? Like, leave their village completely unprotected? Because if you think about it, the Fire Nation could just destroy them outright. But in some other ways, if you think about it, if they're left completely unprotected, I guess there's no reason to attack them. And they're already decimated so hard that there's no point in it as well.
I feel like the Southern was so small that Fire Nation never took it seriously. So I
mean, they took it seriously. They took all the waterbenders away. So I guess after that point,
they probably felt that they were already basically destroyed at that point.
Yeah.
There's no waterbenders. There's no threat.
I mean, the village was so small. Like, it's like, it's almost crazy how it changed.
That's because all the men are gone, like helping with the war effort.
Yeah, I think that the four elements that we discussed here with the show, the fight styles, the plot, the comedy, and then the character development that were introduced to more of the characters through their interactions with each other, through the comedy that we see, through the fights that happened. And so I think it's a really solid episode grouping, because you guys remember when this first aired, it wasn't aired as like the first episode and then we waited a week until the second episode, but rather these two episodes were aired together at the same time. So there was really no break back when it first aired between
honestly,
episodes.
as a kid, I watched everything out of order. So as my first viewing, like
Same, but I remember the premiere of the show, and I
Me
remember
too.
that I remember seeing both of them together.
nice.
And so in my mind, these were all
lucky you guys.
in my mind, these two episodes, this was all like the first episode, like in my mind, until like I went back later and I realized, oh, this is episode 1 and episode 2.
Gotcha.
The first episode, while it's a good introduction, it doesn't really give you that fullness of what the show is going to be or what it's kind of going to until we get into the action, until we get into that stuff that kind of grips you. And then we get to know, like, okay, this is the ride that we're on.
Yeah, and the Avatar state also is a great thing to do in this episode.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it generates a lot of interest, shows that Aang is also badass, not just silly.
Yeah.
And it shows us like power, and we love seeing that in a main character or in general, just seeing like a spectacle. And
Absolutely.
one other thing I really enjoyed, when Zuko and Iroh both combined their efforts into a fireball,
Yeah.
dude, that had some range. Did you guys see that?
Yeah.
That was like as much range as a catapult. I can't recall another scene where like someone could firebend that far away. Can you guys? I know it's on the spot, but like obviously without like Sozin's comment.
Yeah.
See, it's tough because normally what happens is with the ships, they usually have like those giant rocks and they kept catapult.
Yeah.
kind of thing,
But they didn't do that.
It's very interesting about that. But
Yeah.
Nothing comes to mind right now.
Because usually the fire dissipates like pretty quickly.
Yeah.
But that fireball, man, it had range.
Yeah.
If you guys in the comments like happen to know an episode where somebody demonstrated longer range for their firebending compared to that Zuko Iroh fireball,
Yeah.
let us know.
Yeah, I want to add the idea of like with the character interactions, you also can see the sort of the development, right? Because like for example with Sokka, Sokka is kind of this non-believer, and it's like the part with Appa flying is kind of a good example of him becoming more of a believer and whatnot.
Even though Katara was the one who's like being sympathetic with Appa, was like, oh, you can do it, I believe in you. It was Sokka who remembered the words yip yip that actually made Appa fly. So I think it was interesting that they gave his character that moment, which is cool.
And he also said it again when they left the ship.
One interesting character interaction moment is when, going back to the Zuko staff thing, is when Zuko said, this would be nice for my father, but you're a monk, so I'm assuming you never had a father. Which is sort of an interesting thing, because it's kind of one of those things where you can almost call it's like exposition, because they're trying to establish like Aang's background. But it's kind of done in a way where it's like, you can kind of see the values in a sense where it's like, this guy's always loyal to his father and is trying to please his father. While this person, because he has no parents, that's where the quote unquote irresponsibility kind of comes in.
Yeah, you're right. His whole devotion to his father is like, it's reminiscent of the honor that is part of the worldview of the Fire Nation. Like, it's honor to like your family and to your nation and to the country. Whereas with Aang, the comment about him not like having a father because he's a monk, but that kind of points to the worldview of being detached. And so I think that detachment kind of allows Aang, because he's still young, it allows him to be kind of irresponsible and take light things that are serious, because he doesn't have that same sort of attachment that everyone else around him seems to have. He can make a joke in a very dangerous situation because of that.
I enjoyed the dialogue that you mentioned just because it's dialogue with a purpose. It not only establishes a burn from Zuko, but also like it establishes some lore in the story.
Right, right.
Definitely. Yeah, but the final thing that really stood out to me with the character interactions was the moment where at the end it's like, we're going to help you go to the water tribe, then I'm going to get a waterbender, and Sokka, you get to destroy firebender soldiers, which is funny how it's like Sokka's motivation's like, oh, I just get to destroy some bad guys.
Zuko, you really like that word, huh? Destroy.
Yes, exactly. So it's really interesting how much they changed Sokka's character, because his motivation is to end the war. So it's true that when they mentioned the whole like, oh, you get to attack some Fire Nation's soldiers, but
Fire neighbors.
Fire neighbors. I was gonna say Fire Navy, but the point is, it's really shown within this episode that Sokka's kind of like, you kind of look at Sokka as sort of this sort of stubborn kind of idiot that needs to be proven, and then now you see in the end of the series like he's one of the most like, if not valuable members of Team Avatar, like the valuable member of Team Avatar. So it's crazy how much things in this first episode, whether they use or not use, like the things they did use, you really see how impactful it was, and the things they don't use, you really see why they didn't use it later on in the series. So
yeah, and we'll definitely, get into that once we hit those episodes. But this was just our episode 2 deep dive, and let us know your thoughts about episode 2. We're gonna do this for pretty much every single episode of Avatar, just because of how much we love the show. So be sure to like and subscribe if you want to see some more.
Yeah.
Peace.
Later.